Yeah. So welcome to my talk. I'm going to talk about things that we don't like. As per the conference request, I must identify all non-free software I will talk about in my talk. I will talk about iOS, macOS, and other Apple products, but I will try to do it as little as possible. But given the title of the talk, you might imagine that I will talk about it at all. Okay. I might talk about other non-free things, but I really don't think so, and they'll be dwarfed in comparison so much you won't even notice. Okay. So, what is the problem with iOS? Other than, the actual problem with iOS. What is our problem for us as free and open source software developers? The problem is that there aren't a lot of contributors who have iPhones because, none of us want to have iPhones. And there aren't a lot of users uh, that are part of the community already that have iPhones. And so for us in XMPP, this has been a problem historically because we get, that one volunteer who's really excited and is like, I'm going to make a great iOS app for XMPP. And then they go and they start doing it. But they're not that lots of projects aren't like this, but they end up doing quite a lot of it just themselves, which, lots of projects are like that. But even when it comes to testing and bug reports and anything like that, a lot more of it than usual ends up being on the maintainer because the sorts of people that want there to be an XMPP iOS app are not people who are free software enthusiasts who use XMPP and want to use an XMPP app on their iPhone, which they do not have, but they would like their brother-in-law to use it on his iPhone so that he can be in the family group chat. And then when it doesn't work right for their brother-in-law who lives across the country, which is the whole reason they have to have a group chat in the first place, then they're getting reports from this person about it not working, and then they're trying to report to the maintainer and say, oh, it doesn't work. And the maintainer says, oh, what happens when you do this? I don't know. I'll see my brother-in-law at Thanksgiving and see what I can find out. It's not a very fluid process. Not that bug reporting and community management is ever a fluid process, but there are more problems because of the reduced amount of people who are really close to the project that have access to the testing hardware. And there's also, amongst a lot of free software developers, I feel like there's a pretty low motivation to even work on the problem. I certainly know that I had this. I still do, despite now working on the problem. And for years, I would always say, people would say, "Oh well, we want to use JMP from iOS, and none of the apps are very good." And I would say, "Then get an Android phone." Right? Will solve your problem and many more problems, which is true, but not particularly helpful, perhaps. But yeah, it's basically the opposite of the traditional open source scratch your own itch. It's like scratch an itch that neither you nor any of your friends have, but your friend's brother-in-law has, which is not quite as motivating for a lot of people. So that's sort of the problem, and I think that this is a problem that's not specific to XMPP. I've definitely seen it played out a couple of times in the XMPP space, but I think there's a lot of free software projects where people say, "Oh, it would be so nice if we had access to this on iOS for people who have iPhones and, just maybe aren't ready to make the switch yet, but I could communicate with them better or share files with them better or whatever if they were able to use this." And you end up with a lot of the same problems in many of these cases, right? Because they should just use a better OS, and then we wouldn't have this problem, right? Which is, a solution until it's not, because it's obviously not a real. It's the sort of thing that sounds nice and that I think works well if you have something that is so important to people that they're willing to buy a new phone just to use your thing. And I'm happy to say that this has in fact ever happened. People buying a new phone just to use a thing, which is great because then they get the better, more free stack as well. But it's, I think, very impractical. I think we would all agree in many cases. So this is a traditional thing that we used to talk about all the time, and then it sort of fell out of favor for a long time. Was this idea of what if we made everything a web app? I know 20 years ago, everybody was like, the web is going to save us by bringing apps to Linux so that people can, use, get off of Microsoft Office or whatever it was that people were using 20 years ago. And the the thing is that web apps have come a ridiculously long way, to the point that people now hate them instead, which is great. Always good to have a nice pendulum swing. Um, so what's but it also means it's now possible to write not a web app in the traditional sense, but an app that makes use of a web browser to do most of the sorts of things that an app might do. So we had this transition from web apps to single page apps on our road towards everybody hating us, and where the idea was, okay, instead of having a web app where you have a server component and you're reloading new pages and all the things that a web app does, there was this big popular move to building API servers that you would talk to from the front end. And that ultimately led to where we are now, where you can actually have an app, which you could think of as a web app if you want to, in that it is built using HTML and JavaScript and rendered by the same kind of front end as a web page would be, but there's no server, there's no HTTP involved at all, except to download the HTML in the first place if you wanted to, you have to get it from somewhere. But like there's no, right, you can have an app it's just a native app. And what's interesting about this to me is that in the free software community for a long time, we've had a lot of rhetoric and stuff around how, JavaScript is bad and these rich apps are bad because it's like installing an app on your device. It's just like installing an app on your device. And so it's a proprietary app on your device. But what if it's not proprietary? What if it's a free app? And the fact that we're trying to make an app really, to me, this is a big benefit, because the reason that this is bad is that it's an app when it should be a web page, or it's an app and so it's not free. But if it is free and what we wanted was an app, then it's really fitting in pretty well. And it's getting very, very close, I think, for most purposes, to being able to fill people's needs. There's a lot of things that you can do now, even in the last 2 or 3 years, with a progressive web app that you couldn't do 10 years ago. And I know when the iPhone first came out, this was even Apple's plan, right? Officially was like, no App Store, we'll just use the web. And then they were like, oh, never mind, that's not good enough. But it is now, pretty much. And in fact, mostly the ways that it isn't are Apple's fault. So I have some examples here of this kind of app. Right, so the Flow e-reader, it's an ebook reader. It's built entirely as a web page. It's just a bunch of HTML and JavaScript. You go to the web page, you hit the install to home screen, but there's no server, right? It's not a web app. There's no forms, there's no server, there's no Ajax. It's just an app, exactly the same as FB Reader or any other e-reader would be. You load EPUB files from your local device, you read them on your local screen, it bookmarks where you were. It's just a regular e-reader that happens to be built with web technologies, and it works really well on the iPhone, and also on your desktop, and also on your Android phone, because it's built without any particular platform tie-ins. This is a Bible reader that I use called Astro Bible, very similar, right? I pull up the app, gives you a list of the books of the Bible, you tap, 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 and you're in, just like any Bible app you would get out of F-Droid, but without being tied to anything. So it's now an open source app that just works on the iPhone, right? Number calculator notebook, it's one of those like calculators where you instead of having a skinomorphic calculator, you write out your equations and it gives you numbers on the side. Very nice. I use that. Snape Layer, I haven't actually used a lot. I just tested it to make sure it works so that I could put it in my slides. But it's just a music player. And it works like the built-in music player on any of these mobile platforms would work, but you can use it in any browser anywhere. And if you install to home screen, then it pops up. It looks and feels exactly like a native music player app. You pick some songs, you make some playlists, you hit play. It's just a music player. And so these are like completely offline, serverless experiences. You know, a lot of the like whatever out there, they'll talk about like offline first when they're in the industry, because they still want to have a server because they want to have accounts and tracking and all those things. But these experiences are getting to the point of, it's not even offline first, it's offline only. It's just an offline app. There's no network connectivity, except of course to download it in the first place, which you have to do with a native app also. Yeah. And none of these, all of these I've tested on the iPhone, and they work very well on the iPhone. None of these are developed by someone who has an iPhone. The developer doesn't have an iPhone. The main people using it don't have an iPhone. And so they're able to do their development themselves in the environment they're used to, test on devices they actually have, right? There's no proprietary software involved necessarily in their development stack. I don't know what text editors or whatever every single one of these developers is using, but it doesn't need to be, certainly. And when they send it to users who are enthusiastic about what they're doing in the project, those users don't have to have iPhones either, and yet all of the bug reports and feedback and everything that they do in the maintenance of these apps can go towards the iOS compatible experience that is produced. Yeah, so that's very nice. So there's a bunch of ways that you can write this kind of app. You can write it in just, normal TypeScript, and just build a web thing the way that any other front end would be built, just without having a back end. And again, like I said before, a lot of times we in this community get really grumpy about things that are built this way, and we say, oh, it's so hard to package this stuff, and all these tools are only built to build these apps that could have just been web pages. And I think what's interesting about this particular subset of cases is that these are things that couldn't have just been web pages, because the whole point is that the alternative is actually to build, a native app. And it's almost the opposite of the traditional problem. And so, yeah, so obviously that's a perfectly fine way to do it. There are a couple other ways to do it, which are interesting to me for a couple of reasons that I'll talk about. So you can use React Native, which makes no sense at first, because React Native is to build native apps using React technologies. But there's an adapter to use React Native as a web app again. And you're like, why would you even want that? That's insane. And the reason that you might want this is if you want to have the option to also ship a native app, which I'll talk about why you might want to do that. This gives you an ability to build it and test it as a PWA, distribute it with all the benefits that has, so it's coming out over the web browser, so it's a cross-platform form by default, all those things, and you can have those benefits, but still gives you the option to later very easily also make an effectively native experience using native widgets by shipping using one of the other React Native drivers. I have not done this for any of my apps yet, but it's definitely on my horizon as one of the things that you could want to do, because it gives you that, we're building for pure web with just TypeScript will get you the cross-platform. If you wanted to go native, you can't. You can build a web wrapper Electron style or Tory or whatever and put it on a phone, and that's fine. That can work well for some cases, but this gives you some more flexibility and options that could be interesting in some cases. I'm using this. This is called, Hax is a programming language that can compile to multiple backends. In my case so far, the very interesting ones are JavaScript and C++. So all of the backend, all the non-UI code for the web apps that I'm building, I write in Hax and compile it to JavaScript. But then if I ever want to go native, similar to the React Native concept, I can compile also to C++ and then ship native apps on Android and iOS and anywhere else that C++ works, with some additional work, of course, but with most of the code already written and being reused, so that's the strategy that I've been employing so far. There's a couple of reasons for that. In my case, one is that I wanted to build backends that other people who aren't me could also use to write native UIs on platforms I might not have thought of, or kinds of native UIs I hadn't thought of. So I'm building like a whole SDK layer in Hacks for this reason. And one of the other reasons that we chose Hacks is that we thought it would be interesting. It has some other targets like C#. So in the long term, if we wanted to do something targeting Windows, which has a lot of the same problems as targeting iOS, although not quite as bad, it also gives us an avenue towards that kind of thing. So we're experimenting with that a little bit. Yeah. So when you're building these progressive web apps, you can, for the most part, just test in your desktop browser. You just fire up Firefox, or something that isn't Firefox if you prefer, on your regular system, and most of the things that you're going to care about in your mainline development are going to just work. If you want to see what it's going to look like on a mobile view, Firefox has a little button in the developer tools to shrink down to all the various sizes of the various mobile devices out there, so you can see what that's going to look like. It has emulation for touch events and all that, so you can see what if you need some swipey thing or whatever in your app, you can test all that. So it makes the developer experience very nice, very simple. You don't need any custom stuff. You're not, going out and getting Xcode or like any of this kind of nonsense from any proprietary platform. It's just the web browser you already have, the Emacs, the Vim, the whatever it is that you type in that you already have, and you just go. And you can do really the bulk of your stuff that way, up to and including even web push. When I was first doing push notifications for this app, I did all the prototyping for that just on my desktop. Firefox on desktop supports web push, and so I could, close the tab and emulate having the app completely gone, just like it would be if you turned the screen off on iOS, and then see the notifications still coming in Firefox. So there's quite a lot you can do without even having a mobile device at all, which really is a huge improvement for a lot of people in terms of their development cycle. Right, it's not even an emulator, it's nothing, it's just the browser you probably had open anyway so that you could look up documentation, which is very nice for early development and prototyping and all those kinds of things. So I said no server. This is the one case where that's not necessarily true. It's not a web server per se, but if you need push notifications of any kind, you do need somewhere that the pushes are coming from, obviously. So in my case, it's very small because we're doing XMPP. We built an XMPP extension that is able to have the user's server do all of the encryption and everything from there for web push, but we still have to host like a tiny little shim basically that turns the XMPP payload into a post to the right HTTP endpoint, which we don't technically have to do. Even we could have their server post directly, but XMPP server operators are not super thrilled about posting to random URLs from inside their infrastructure at the say-so of a client. So that's the way it works right now. But it's very small, and even they could host that shim themselves locally instead of using the one that I host if they want to in the future. So it doesn't even have to be a server that's operated by the person running the app for web push. It just has to be a server somewhere that wants to say something, which usually if you have some external thing coming in, there's a reason you have that. So in our case, that's the XMPP server. Yeah. Okay. So then you can also install with a mobile browser as an app. So you can use Firefox on your Android phone, for example, or Fennec or whatever, and just use the install to home screen function and get some more testing done that way. Like I said, most of your mobile functionality you can test on desktop just fine. There are a few things that are hard or impossible to test from desktop. Obviously, daily driving kinds of use are hard to test from desktop. Like with my chat app, I'm not carrying my desktop around in my pocket all day, so I don't get the same, kind of testing outcome from that. But there's also a few things. So share API, this is something to let you tap a button in the app and, pull up that share sheet on Android or whatever that lets you share to other apps. And that's a kind of native integration that people often expect from an app. But if you use Share API in Firefox on desktop, it does not do anything because GNOME doesn't have a share sheet. So what would it even do? So it just does nothing. I kind of feel like it could at least pop up a thing that it offers to email the link to someone or something, but it does not at the moment do anything. So, and then Badge API is another context here. So all that does is when you've got the icon for the app on mobile, you can, from JavaScript, tell it what number to put. You know how Android will put the little number on top of the app icon to say, like, there's new messages in here or whatever. So you could, obviously on desktop, that doesn't make any sense. Where would that number even go? I mean, I kind of feel like it could go in the favicon area, but they don't do that. So there's a couple little things like this that we're moving to a real mobile browser will let you test some of these more advanced integrations, which you may want to do eventually. And then, yeah, this is, like I said before, being able to reuse the code, whether it's most of the code or even the whole app, on multiple platforms. There are downsides to multi-platform, which are well known, but one of the big upsides is that when you're getting your testing and feedback from a different platform, it helps the app across everywhere. So I was doing PWA work for over a year before I started on anything that was iOS specific in any way, and all of that feedback and testing has gone into the, is now available to the iOS users as well, in a way that with an iOS app, nobody's using it except the iOS users, and you don't get that same amount of feedback, which can be useful. So, like I said, one of the things that people always like to complain about cross-platform apps, one of the things they complain about is that they don't look native. Well, you could sort of solve this for the iOS users in a pretty easy way. You could just make the app look like an iOS app. Now, on desktop and Android, this means it will still look like an iOS app if you choose this as your strategy. But if what you're doing is trying to solve the iOS problem, then making it look like an iOS app gets your main target first. And honestly, as a general rule, the people who are going to complain the loudest about it not looking native are the iOS people. So if you make it look like an iOS app, the number of Android users who will be like, oh, this looks like an iOS app, I hate it, will be much lower than if you do the reverse of that, or if you make it look like some totally random third thing. You can, of course, also do it with selectors. It's possible to have the CSS be slightly different on each platform and have it look native on iOS and look native on Android. That's totally doable. It's just more work. And, of course, at that point, you're introducing an iOS-specific code path, which means that part is only being tested by the iOS users. Now, this may be inevitable depending on your goals for your application and your community, and it's certainly still a smaller problem than having the whole app be only tested by iOS people, but it is something to consider. And, of course, now we get to this part. You might want to test with an iPhone. So I have an iPhone. I'm famously the only person here in the whole conference with an iPhone. Oh, right. I forgot. Philip also brought one. You might not want to do this. Obviously, you don't actually want to do this. But there are reasons why it may be beneficial in the long term if it's something that you can stomach. There are going to be, Safari-specific bugs that you won't run into on other browsers. There will be, even when I first ran my PWA on an iPhone, there were even just little things that I would never have thought of, and probably no one would have reported for months, even among the iOS users. Like the bottom of the screen is curved, and the web page extends to the bottom of the screen. So if you let the content of the page go to the bottom, then the corners of the content are cut off. Which is sort of a thing that is known about iPhones, but not a thing that remotely occurred to me until I pulled up the app on the iPhone and was like, oh, you just can't see this button because it's off the corner of the screen. And it's like 2 lines of CSS to fix that in a totally generic way. I also found some bugs with the storage driver in Safari, and some other things like this. So it's obviously the whole point of this is that you don't need to have an iPhone, but being able to test at all ever on an iPhone is certainly advantageous if for quality reasons in the long term. So it's sort of a trade-off, right? Like if you have a team, you certainly wouldn't need everyone on, if you were building an iOS app, everyone on the team would need a Mac and an iPhone, whereas with this, maybe there's an iThing you get used somewhere, that you can pass around for testing purposes. Or maybe you just do hallway testing with people. You grab them at a conference and say, "Oh, you have an iPhone. Can you look at this webpage real quick so I can see what's," So you have to think about what level of comfort you have. Obviously, we would prefer to not use the iOS at all, and we can get pretty close. But you will. There are bugs you won't detect if nobody is testing on an iPhone. So something to think about. Oh yeah, this is just a fun fact. You can't detect iPads in a web app because Apple decided, I don't remember when, a few years ago, Apple decided that the iPad browser is as good as a Mac browser now, and so it reports itself as a Mac. The user agent says Mac, all the JavaScript things say Mac. What you can sort of fake it a little bit by asking if it's a Mac with a touch screen, because there mostly aren't Macs with touch screens, and there aren't any iPads without touch screens, so you can sort of say if it's a Mac with a touch screen, it's probably an iPad, but it's a bit weird. There's definitely no good way to do it. There's only, at best, heuristic hacks, which is probably not relevant to anybody, but it bothered me because I wanted to make it so when you came to if you went to the page in the browser, it would just pop up with instructions on how to install it to the home screen as an app, because it's not supposed to be used in the browser, it's an app. And that works fine on iPhone, but on iPad I couldn't reliably make it work because I couldn't detect whether you were on an iPad or a Mac. I didn't want to show that screen on the Mac because there is no, the add to home screen thing doesn't apply in that case. So anyway, just fun little things that, again, I wouldn't have found out if I hadn't tried actually testing on real iDevices. So I don't have an iPad. That was just a test I did on someone's. And that's, you don't need a big in-depth thing here, but some things to think about. So after all that and telling you that you definitely don't need to have an iPhone, but then maybe you do, and then telling you that you definitely don't need to build a native app, I'm now going to say why you might still. So there are a small number of reasons why you might still want to end up with something that is, in some sense, a native app. And like I said before, this doesn't have to involve, buying a Mac and doing everything in Xcode necessarily. You could have React Native on web and then use React Native for native later. And there's a couple different options here, which I think I'll talk about more in a second. But so the biggest one is the App Store. If you want to be in the App Store on iOS, you can't be a web app or a PWA, because they don't put web links in the App Store, only apps. Of course, one of the benefits of being a PWA is that you don't need the App Store. You circumvent that whole ecosystem entirely. You don't have to deal with Apple or any of their problems. You just put up a link and people go to it in the browser and install it, and it's great. On the other hand, people often expect to find an app in the App Store, and if you say to them, "Oh, get my great chat app for iOS," and they're like, "Great, what do I search for in the App Store?" And you say, "Actually, don't look in the App Store." Some people will be confused by that. This may not affect you in your project. All of the ones I listed before are not available in the App Store, and they work on iOS just fine, but discoverability may be something to consider. You can get slightly better notifications if you go native. So the web push works great on iOS, and notifications do work fine if it's installed to home screen. But you can only get the one kind of notification where you have a title and link and whatever. So for example, in my case where I'm building a chat app, I couldn't have the kind that shows the avatar of a group and lists the names of the people in the group, but this is the person who sent those different styles of notification. There's also things like posting a persistent notification that updates over time with live progress of something that's happening, which Android and iOS both have. You can't do that from web. So depending on your app's needs, you might get some slightly deeper integrations, and stuff like that. So just if you need access to one of those things, or not need, but if you would benefit from access to some of these slightly deeper integrations than web has yet, then sometimes there's a reason to consider still having a native app. I would recommend sharing as much code of it as possible with the other experiences, even if you do choose to go for a fully native app, but it's something that may come up. And of course, there's all these other non-iOS things that Apple has now, tvOS, visionOS, watchOS, which for the most part don't support PWA or have good browsers at all. You're not installing a web app on an Apple Watch. But if you have a chat app and you want people to get notified on their Apple Watch, you might want to produce something for that, which won't be able to sidecar into a web app. Right. So not everything is perfectly solved for every use case. I think a lot of use cases it is. That ebook app doesn't need deeper integration. It doesn't need notifications. It doesn't need to run on a watch. That ebook app is perfect as a PWA, and it runs great on iOS. But for the chat app case that I'm working on, to try and make a really good flagship experience, there was some reasons to consider still making something native. So Tori is your easiest option if you started with a PWA to go native. You wrap it up, and it makes a native app for you that basically just renders the PWA. But now you have access to call arbitrary native code from the JavaScript, which means you can have the same web app that you have normally, but you want to call that one extra native API that isn't available from web, fine. We can proxy that through Tori, and you can call into that to get your more native notifications or whatever specific integration point you were looking for. So that's a really great choice. And definitely if you're primarily targeting web and cross, it's your easiest choice. Or if the only thing you wanted was to have it in the App Store at all, obviously the easiest choice. It's the exact same thing. You're just compensating for the fact that they don't let you put the PWA directly in the App Store by wrapping it. This thing is really cool. I haven't used it a lot yet, but so there's this new project called Xtool that lets you build fully native iOS apps that are written in Swift and like everything like an Apple iOS app on Linux and install it to real iPhones from Linux, and will possibly soon support uploading it to the App Store from Linux, which means that you won't need to have a Mac or see a Mac or do anything with a Mac, even to build a like completely native iOS app in Swift. So I'm kind of excited about the opportunities there for teams like this, where even if one person maybe still has the iPhone or whatever, but you're trying to minimize the impact of this on your contributors and your open source community, and they're coming and saying, hey, I want to like just mess around with this app and maybe add a patch, but I don't want to buy a Mac to do it. It's like, well, okay, this sort of tooling is becoming available to make that more accessible. I'm going to talk really briefly about the GPL problem on iOS. Because as soon as you're going from, you don't have this problem if you're doing the PWA. You just distribute your PWA and you distribute your source code and you comply with the license and everything's fine. But as soon as you're deploying into the App Store, there is an open question of common debate about whether or not there is a conflict between the terms of the GPL agreements and the terms of the App Store. One of the reasons that this is a matter of debate is because the terms of the App Store change on a regular basis, which means it may have been incompatible in the past and no longer be incompatible, or it may have been compatible in the past and no longer be compatible. And so people are always worried about this kind of thing. There's a lot of ways in which it used to be basically impossible to fulfill the requirements of the GPL agreements with an iOS app in the App Store, because you couldn't, for example, install a modified version back onto your own device without also buying a Mac and also getting a $100 a year Apple developer account and all these things, which are obviously silly, unacceptable restrictions. None of that is actually required anymore, right? Xtool on Linux with a free Apple account that you don't pay anything for or do anything with can install back onto the same device a modified version. So a lot of that stuff is less relevant than it used to be, but it's an open question. So if you have GPL dependencies in your web app and then you just wrap it in Tori and go, you might suddenly realize, oh wait, we're no longer compliant, or some people think we aren't. It might be a consideration for you. And yeah, today I think Xtool is going to get there, but Xtool is early days. So if you are submitting to the App Store, if that's a thing that you have decided for your project does still need to be done, then someone might still need a Mac. I didn't say you needed Mac hardware. I don't know. It's your choice. Hackintoshes are getting actually harder to make. Even Hackintosh VMs are getting harder to make, but I still know people who are doing it, so it's possible. But, and this is the thing I've been harping on the whole way through, your drive-by contributors, your new contributors, most people on your team even won't need a Mac or an iPhone doing any of the things that I've been talking about here, right? Even if someone ends up needing an iPhone, even if someone ends up needing a Mac, most people aren't going to need it just to try something out, add a new feature, fix a bug, send some feedback. Most people are going to be able to meaningfully contribute to the project without that, which has not really been the case historically for most even open source iOS projects. Usually you need to have a pretty solid buy-in to the Apple ecosystem to contribute because you just couldn't even compile the app without that. And you can get your feedback and your bug reports from your core user base who are all using Android phones, and it won't be, and it will still benefit the app. So you're still getting more and more polish in the app despite that. And that's it. Anybody have a question?
So is there a kind of like halfway point of like an emulator or something like you have with Android, where it's not, you're not getting the exact experience you would on a physical device, but you just run it?
Right. So if it depends on which stack you go with. I talked about a couple of options. Obviously, if you go with a pure PWA, then you're going to get really, really close if you use GNOME Web, because it's based on WebKit still. And so it's going to be the closest experience on Linux to Safari on iOS. And if you run GNOME Web in the mobile view, then that's going to be your closest equivalent to an iOS PWA running on Linux, and that gives you something kind of like a most of the way simulator for that environment. React Native, obviously, you have the same thing. You can run the React Native app in even the Android emulator using the Android build, or binding it to web and running it in GNOME Web. Or there's a couple of different ways that you can test React Native apps and see something very similar to what will happen on an iPhone without an iPhone. But if you're building, if you take a cross-platform backend and then you write like a Swift UI on the front, then there's no way at the moment. You could use Xtool to build and compile it on Linux, but to run it, you have to have iOS, and there's no simulator for that. So if that's the stack you ultimately chose, it wouldn't be an option. But for the other two, there's definitely a bunch of ways to test without having any. It's basically about the fidelity of the test, right? You're trading off your personal software freedom against the fidelity of testing to benefit the users. And I'm not going to tell anyone what the right choice is for your project. Obviously, it would be better for everyone if we didn't have to make this choice at all. And I'm glad that we're increasingly being able to reduce the amount of this choice that we have to make, but there is still going to be some small trade-off between if no one who ever touches the code ever touches an iPhone, then there will probably be some level of polish that is missed just because no one's seen the rounded corners, no one's noticed this, one thing, that kind of thing.
There are QEMU devs who are making good progress with being able to have QEMU boot iOS, but yeah.
Yeah, it's not there. Yeah.
Is it possible to create an additional permission to the GPL that might solve the GPL problem? And is that something you would like to have?
Yes, I mean, so for example, libsignal has such an additional permission that the Signal Foundation wrote and are using, and I have a custom one that I got from somewhere, I think, that I'm using in one of my projects. But having like an officially whatever, something recognized by someone who's knows what they're doing that we could all use would probably be beneficial over everybody reinventing it. Or an official opinion that this isn't a problem anymore would it be also great. But yeah. Any other questions? No? Pretty good? All right. Thank you very much.